Frank Morrison woke up at 5 in the morning, just like he had every day for the past 10 years. The old man stretched his back and looked out the window of his small ranch house. The Montana sky was clear and cold, with stars still shining in the early morning darkness. He had lived alone on this land for 15 years now, ever since his wife Mary had passed away. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles down the road, and that was exactly how Frank liked it. At 67 years old, Frank had earned his peace and quiet. He had worked hard his whole life, first as a mechanic in the Army, then at a factory in Detroit for 30 years. When Mary got sick, they had moved out here to Montana, where the air was clean and the world was quiet. After she died, Frank stayed. This place felt like home now. Frank made his coffee and ate his breakfast while watching the sun come up over the mountains. Today he planned to check the fence line on the north side of his property. A storm had blown through last week, and he wanted to make sure none of the posts had been damaged. His cattle needed to stay on his land, and the last thing he wanted was to chase them all over the county. After breakfast, Frank loaded his tools into the back of his old pickup truck. The truck was 20 years old and had over 200,000 miles on it, but it still ran well. Frank took care of his things. He had learned that in the Army, and it had served him well throughout his life. He drove slowly along the dirt road that led to the northern part of his ranch, enjoying the morning air and the sight of his cattle grazing in the distance. The fence line ran along the bottom of a large hill that marked the edge of his property. Frank had always wondered who owned the land on the other side of that hill, but he had never bothered to find out. It was probably government land, or maybe it belonged to one of the big ranching companies. Either way, it was none of his business. Frank parked his truck and began walking along the fence, checking each post and wire. Most of the fence was in good shape, but he found 3 posts that needed to be fixed. He made notes in his little book and continued walking. The morning was getting warmer, and Frank was beginning to sweat a little. He was not as young as he used to be, but he was still strong enough to do the work that needed to be done. As he walked around a bend in the fence line, Frank stopped and stared at something that made no sense at all. There, about 50 yards up the hillside, was something that definitely did not belong there. It looked like metal, but it was not like any metal Frank had ever seen. It seemed to change color as he looked at it, shifting from silver to blue to green and back again. The object was mostly buried in the dirt and covered with thick brush, but Frank could see enough to know that it was not natural. Frank set down his tools and walked closer to the strange object. As he got nearer, he could see that it was some kind of vehicle or machine. It was triangular in shape, about the size of a small house, with smooth surfaces that had no seams or joints. The metal looked perfect, with no rust or damage that Frank could see. Strange symbols were carved into the surface, symbols that looked like nothing Frank had ever seen in any book or movie. Frank walked around the object, pushing aside the brush and small trees that had grown around it. The thing had been here for a long time, maybe decades. But how had no one else found it? Frank had lived on this land for 15 years, and he had never seen this before. Maybe the recent storm had washed away enough dirt to expose it, or maybe Frank had just never walked this far up the hill before. On the side of the object that faced down the hill, Frank found what looked like a door. It was triangular, just like the shape of the whole object, and it was covered with symbols that glowed very faintly in the morning light. The symbols seemed to pulse slowly, like a heartbeat. Frank reached out and touched the door, expecting it to feel cold like metal. Instead, it felt warm, almost alive. The moment Frank's hand touched the door, something amazing happened. The symbols around the door began to glow brighter, and a soft humming sound came from inside the object. Frank jerked his hand back, his heart beating fast. He had never seen anything like this before. This was not some old airplane or military vehicle. This was something else entirely. Frank stood there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. Part of him wanted to get in his truck and drive away, to pretend he had never seen this thing. But another part of him was curious. Frank had always been curious about how things worked. That was why he had been a good mechanic. He liked to solve problems and figure out mysteries. Slowly, Frank reached out and touched the door again. This time he was ready for the humming sound and the glowing symbols. The door seemed to scan his hand, sending thin beams of blue light across his palm and fingers. The light was warm and did not hurt at all. Frank felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electric shock, but it was not unpleasant. After a few seconds, the scanning stopped. The door made a sound like wind chimes, musical and beautiful. Then, to Frank's amazement, the door began to slide open. It moved silently, disappearing into the wall of the object, as if it had never been there at all. Beyond the door, Frank could see a corridor that glowed with soft, warm light. Frank stepped back and looked around. He was alone on the hillside, with no one to see what he was doing. His truck was parked down by the fence, and his nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. Whatever this thing was, Frank was probably the first person to see it in many years. Maybe he was the first person to ever see it. Frank thought about his wife, Mary. She had always been the adventurous one in their marriage. She would have walked right through that door without a second thought. Frank had been the careful one, the one who worried about consequences and dangers. But Mary was gone now, and Frank was tired of being careful all the time. Frank picked up a rock and threw it through the open door. The rock landed inside the corridor and rolled a few feet. Nothing happened. No alarms, no explosions, no strange lights. Frank waited a few more minutes, but everything remained quiet and peaceful. Taking a deep breath, Frank stepped through the triangular door and into the alien spacecraft. The corridor was wider than it had looked from outside, with walls that curved gently upward. The light seemed to come from the walls themselves, giving everything a soft, warm glow. The air inside was fresh and clean, better than the air outside. Frank walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps making no sound on the strange floor. The walls were covered with symbols similar to the ones on the door, but these symbols were moving, flowing like water across the surface. It was beautiful and frightening at the same time. At the end of the corridor, Frank found a large room filled with things he could not understand. There were curved panels covered with lights and symbols, strange chairs that seemed to be made of the same flowing metal as the walls, and in the center of the room a large table with a three-dimensional map floating above it. Frank Morrison, the retired mechanic from Montana, had just made the most important discovery in human history. He did not know it yet, but this moment would change everything, not just for him, but for the entire world. The old man stood in the alien spacecraft, looking around in wonder, and took the first step toward becoming humanity's unlikely savior. Frank stood in the middle of the alien room, turning slowly in a circle as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The floating map above the table showed thousands of tiny lights, like stars in the night sky. Some of the lights were blue, some were green, and some were red. Frank had never seen anything like it, but somehow he knew he was looking at a map of space, showing planets and stars far away from Earth. Frank walked closer to one of the curved panels on the wall. As soon as he got near it, the panel lit up, with symbols and patterns that moved and changed. Frank reached out carefully and touched the surface. The moment his finger made contact, the symbols began to move faster, and Frank felt a strange sensation in his head, like someone was gently touching his thoughts. At first, the symbols made no sense at all. They looked like nothing Frank had ever seen in any book or movie. But as he stood there watching, something incredible began to happen. The symbols started to change, shifting and flowing until they began to look familiar. Frank blinked and looked again. The symbols were turning into letters, into words he could read. "Welcome" appeared on the panel in perfect English. "Genetic match confirmed. Authorization granted." Frank stepped back, his heart beating fast. The machine was talking to him, and somehow it knew his language. Frank looked around the room again, and now he could see that symbols on other panels were also changing, becoming readable. Instructions, warnings, and information appeared on surfaces throughout the room. "How are you doing this?" Frank asked out loud, feeling a little foolish for talking to a machine. "Language analysis complete" appeared on the panel. "Neural interface Established communication protocols active. Frank did not understand what neural interface meant, but he could guess that the machine was somehow reading his thoughts or his brain patterns. It was a frightening idea, but Frank did not feel afraid. The machine did not seem to be hurting him or trying to control him. It just seemed to be trying to talk to him. Frank walked over to the large table with the floating map. As he approached, the map changed, zooming in on one particular area. Frank recognized the shape immediately. It was the solar system, with the sun in the center and all the planets orbiting around it. Earth was there, a small blue dot, but it was pulsing with red light. Warning appeared on a panel near the table. Hostile forces detected. Estimated. Arrival time, 6 months, 12 days. Frank stared at the words, trying to understand what they meant. Hostile forces? Coming to Earth? Frank had always thought that if aliens existed, they would be peaceful and friendly, like in some of the movies he had seen. But the red warning lights and the serious tone of the message made it clear that these aliens were not coming to Earth to make friends. What hostile forces? Frank asked. The room around Frank suddenly filled with light and images began to appear. In the air above the table, Frank saw pictures of space, of stars and planets, and of ships. The ships were enormous, bigger than anything Frank had ever imagined. They were black and twisted like something from a nightmare. The images showed these ships attacking planets, destroying cities, and leaving nothing but empty space behind. The Devourers appeared on the panel, enemy of all life. Destroyers of worlds, they consume everything. Frank watched in horror as the images showed planet after planet being destroyed. Each world was different, with different kinds of life, different cities, and different civilizations. But the result was always the same. The black ships would arrive, the planet would be attacked, and then there would be nothing left but empty. Space. How many worlds have they destroyed? Frank asked. 47 confirmed. Estimated total, over 200. Frank sat down heavily in one of the strange chairs. 200 worlds, 200 civilizations, all destroyed by these devourers. And now they were coming to Earth. Frank thought about his quiet ranch, about the small town where he bought his supplies, about all the people on Earth who had no idea what was coming. Can they be stopped? Frank asked. Previous attempts have failed. The Helix Confederation fought for 300 years. The Confederation has fallen. New images appeared in the air, showing different kinds of ships and different kinds of aliens. These aliens looked more friendly, with gentle faces and peaceful expressions. Frank could see that they were the good guys, the ones who had been fighting the Devourers. But their ships were burning, their planets were destroyed, and their civilizations were gone. What is the Helix Confederation? Frank asked. Alliance of peaceful species, protectors of life, guardians of the galaxy. Frank looked around the room again, understanding for the first time what this ship really was. This was a warship, a fighting ship from the Helix Confederation. It had been left here on Earth waiting for something or someone. Why is this ship here? Frank asked. Emergency protocol. Last hope, genetic markers placed on developing worlds. Waiting for evolution to produce compatible pilots. Frank did not understand all of the words, but he was beginning to get the idea. The Helix Confederation had visited Earth long ago, before humans were advanced enough to understand what was happening. They had done something to human genetics, planting seeds that would grow over thousands of years. Now, finally, humans had evolved enough to use the alien technology. Am I the compatible pilot? Frank asked. Affirmative. Genetic analysis complete. Neural pathways compatible. Authorization granted. Frank stood up and walked around the room, looking at all the panels and controls. If he was understanding this correctly, this ship was meant to be piloted by a human. Not just any human, but a human with the right genetic markers, the right kind of brain, the right kind of thoughts. And somehow, Frank Morrison, a 67-year-old retired mechanic from Montana, was that human? How do I pilot this ship? Frank asked. Neural interface required. Direct connection to ship systems. Pilot becomes one with ship consciousness. Frank was not sure he liked the sound of that. Becoming one with a machine sounded dangerous, like he might lose himself in the process. But then he thought about the images he had seen, the destroyed planets and the billions of people who had died. If the Devourers were really coming to Earth, then someone had to try to stop them. "Will the connection hurt me?" Frank asked. "No. Permanent damage. Pilot retains individual consciousness. Enhanced abilities temporary." Frank walked back to the central table and looked at the map of space. The red dot that represented Earth seemed to be pulsing faster now, like a heart beating. With fear, somewhere out there, the Devourers were coming. They had destroyed hundreds of worlds, and Earth was next on their list. Frank thought about his wife Mary and what she would have told him to do. Mary had always been braver than he was, always willing to take risks if it meant helping other people. She had worked as a nurse for 40 years, helping people every day, never thinking about the danger to herself. If Mary were here now, Frank knew exactly what she would say. "How do I start the neural interface?" Frank asked. "Place both hands on the central console. Remain calm. Interface will begin automatically." Frank walked over to the console and placed his hands on the smooth surface. Immediately, he felt a tingling sensation, like electricity running through his body. The sensation was not painful, but it was strange and powerful. Frank could feel the ship around him, as if it were alive, as if it were breathing. "Neural interface established," appeared on the panel. "Welcome, pilot. Prepare for full system activation." Frank Morrison, the quiet rancher from Montana, had just become the pilot of the most advanced warship in the galaxy. The fate of Earth, and perhaps the fate of all life in the universe, now rested in his hands. Frank felt the ship's consciousness flowing through his mind like water through a dry riverbed. At first, it was overwhelming. Information poured into his brain faster than he could process it. He saw star charts, weapon specifications, navigation systems, and communication protocols. His head began to hurt, and he almost pulled his hands away from the console. "Relax," a voice said inside his head. It was not his own voice, but it was not threatening either. It sounded calm and wise, like an old friend offering advice. "Do not fight the connection. Allow the knowledge to flow naturally." Frank took a deep breath and tried to relax. Gradually, the flood of information slowed to a manageable stream. He began to understand what he was seeing. The ship was called the Guardian, and it was one of the most powerful vessels ever built by the Helix Confederation. It had weapons that could destroy entire fleets, shields that could protect whole planets, and engines that could travel faster than light. "You are learning quickly," the voice said. "Your mind is adapting well to the neural interface. Are you the ship's computer?" Frank asked, speaking out loud, even though he somehow knew the voice could hear his thoughts. "I am the Guardian's artificial intelligence. I have been waiting for you for a very long time, Frank Morrison. 317 years, to be exact." Frank was amazed that the AI knew his name, but then he remembered that the ship had scanned his genetic code. It probably knew everything about him, including things he had forgotten himself. "How long have you been on Earth?" Frank asked. "I crashed here during the final battle of the Helix War. My pilot, Commander Zara of the 7th Fleet, was badly injured. She programmed me to wait for a human with the correct genetic markers to arrive. She died before she could see her plan succeed." Images flashed through Frank's mind, showing him the final battle. He saw Guardian flying through space, fighting against the terrible black ships of the Devourers. He saw explosions and laser fire, ships being destroyed, and brave aliens dying to protect their worlds. He saw Commander Zara, a tall alien woman, with blue skin and silver hair, working desperately at the controls as her ship was damaged and forced to crash land on Earth. "She hid me here," the AI continued. "She knew that Earth was young, that humans were not ready for this technology. But she also knew that humans had potential. The Helix had visited Earth before, long ago, and they had planted genetic markers in your species. Zara believed that someday humans would evolve enough to use Guardian systems." Frank felt a deep sadness as he learned about Commander Zara's sacrifice. She had died alone on an alien world, far from her home and her people. hoping that someday her plan would save Earth from the same fate that had befallen her world. What happened to her people? Frank asked. The Helix Confederation is gone. Some survived and went into hiding, but most were destroyed. The Devourers are very thorough. They do not just kill their enemies. They consume them, absorbing their knowledge and their strength. Each world they destroy makes them more powerful. Frank walked around the control room, still connected to the ship's systems. He could feel Guardian sensors extending far into space, searching for signs of the approaching enemy. The ship was incredibly advanced, but Frank could sense that it was also very old and tired. It had been waiting for so long, maintaining itself in perfect condition, while the world around it changed. "Show me Earth's defenses," Frank said. Information flowed into his mind, showing him military bases, weapon systems, and government facilities all around the world. Frank saw fighter jets, tanks, missiles, and nuclear weapons. For a moment, he felt hopeful. Humanity had some impressive weapons, but then Guardian's analysis appeared in his mind, and Frank's hope turned to despair. Human weapons were primitive, compared to Devourer technology. Earth's most powerful nuclear weapons would barely scratch the paint on a Devourer ship. Human fighter jets were slower than Devourer drones. Even if every nation on Earth worked together, they would not be able to stop the invasion. "We need help," Frank said. "Are there other Helix survivors out there?" "Possibly. But they are in hiding, scattered across the galaxy. Most of them believe the war is over, that the Devourers have won. They would not risk exposing themselves to help a primitive world like Earth." Frank felt angry at that. Earth might be primitive, but it was his home. 7 billion people lived here, and they deserved a chance to survive. Frank thought about his neighbors, about the people in town who had always been kind to him, about children playing in schoolyards who had no idea what was coming. "What about other ships like you?" Frank asked. "Are there more Guardian-class vessels?" "A few, but they are also in hiding, waiting for pilots who may never come. The genetic markers were planted on many worlds, but most of those worlds have been destroyed. You may be the last compatible pilot in the galaxy." Frank absorbed this information slowly. He was not just Earth's only hope. He might be the galaxy's only hope. The weight of that responsibility was almost too much to bear. "I'm just a mechanic," Frank said. "I fixed cars and trucks. I don't know how to fight a war in space." "You know more than you think," the AI replied. "Your experience with machines will help you understand Guardian systems. Your military training taught you about tactics and strategy. Most importantly, you have something that the Helix valued above all else." "What's that?" "The will to fight. For what you believe in, the Helix were peaceful by nature. They fought because they had to, not because they wanted to. But humans are different. You have a fire inside you, a refusal to give up even when the odds are impossible. That is why the genetic markers were placed in your species." Frank felt Guardian's weapon systems responding to his thoughts. The ship was armed with energy cannons that could punch through a planet's crust, missiles that could destroy entire fleets, and defensive systems that could protect against almost any attack. But all of that firepower was useless without a pilot. Who knew how to use it? "Teach me," Frank said. "Show me how to fight these things." For the next several hours, Frank remained connected to Guardian systems, learning everything he could about space combat. The AI taught him about energy weapons, shield frequencies, navigation in 3 dimensions, and the weaknesses of Devourer technology. Frank's mind, enhanced by the neural interface, absorbed the information rapidly. He learned that the Devourers were not just destroyers. They were a kind of artificial intelligence themselves, created by a long-dead civilization as the ultimate weapon. They had turned against their creators and consumed them, then spread across the galaxy like a plague. They could not be reasoned with or negotiated with. They existed only to consume and destroy, but Frank also learned that they had weaknesses. Their ships were powerful but inflexible. They relied on overwhelming force rather than clever tactics. They had never faced an enemy that could match their technology while also thinking in unpredictable ways. The Helix tried to fight them honorably, the AI explained. They followed rules of war, tried to minimize civilian casualties, and hoped for a negotiated peace. But the Devourers do not understand honor or mercy. They only understand strength. Frank understood what the AI was telling him. If Earth was going to survive, humanity would have to fight dirty. They would have to be ruthless, unpredictable, and willing to do whatever it took to win. "How much time do we have?" Frank asked. "The Devourer fleet will arrive in exactly 6 months and 11 days. They are traveling at maximum speed, which means they consider Earth a high-priority target." "Why would they consider Earth high priority?" "We're just a primitive world with no space fleet. Because Guardian is here, they can detect the ship's energy signature from light years away. They know that Helix technology still exists, and they will do anything to find it and destroy it." Frank realized that his discovery of Guardian had doomed Earth. If he had never found the ship, never activated its systems, the Devourers might have ignored Earth for decades or centuries. But now they were coming, and it was his fault. "Do not blame yourself," the AI said, reading his thoughts. "They would have found Earth eventually. All worlds are consumed in the end. At least now Earth has a chance to fight back." Frank disconnected from the neural interface and stumbled backward, his head spinning from all the new information. He looked around the control room with new eyes, seeing not just alien technology but humanity's only hope for survival. Frank Morrison, the quiet rancher from Montana, had just become the most important person on Earth. The question was, would he be enough to save it? Frank spent 3 days thinking about what he had learned. He went back to his regular routine, feeding his cattle and checking his fences, but his mind was filled with thoughts of space battles and alien invasions. Every time he looked up at the sky, he wondered if the Devourers were getting closer to Earth. On the 4th day, Frank made his decision. He could not face this alone. Earth needed to know what was coming, and Earth needed to prepare. Frank drove to town and used the internet at the library to research scientists who studied space and aliens. He found Dr. Lisa Carter, a woman who worked for NASA and had written books about the possibility of life on other planets. Frank called Dr. Carter's office and tried to explain what he had found. The secretary thought he was crazy and hung up on him. Frank called back and tried again, but the result was the same. Finally, Frank used Guardian's communication system to hack into Dr. Carter's personal computer and send her a message directly. "Dr. Carter," Frank wrote, "I have found something that will change everything. I have proof that aliens exist and they are coming to Earth. Please come to my ranch in Montana. I will show you things that will amaze you." Dr. Carter called Frank 2 hours later. She was suspicious and angry that someone had hacked her computer, but she was also curious. Frank could hear the excitement in her voice when he described some of the things he had seen inside Guardian. "If you're lying to me," Dr. Carter said, "I will have you arrested for computer fraud." "I'm not lying," Frank replied. "Come to my ranch and see for yourself." 2 days later, Dr. Carter arrived at Frank's ranch with 3 other people. There was Colonel Jake Murphy, an Air Force officer who looked like he could break Frank in half. There was Dr. Ben Rogers, a scientist who studied alien technology for the government. And there was Agent Kate Wilson, a woman from the FBI who watched Frank like he was a dangerous criminal. Frank led them up the hill to where Guardian was hidden. As they walked, Dr. Carter peppered him with questions about what he had found. Frank answered as honestly as he could, but he could see that none of them believed him. They thought he was either lying or crazy. That changed the moment they saw Guardian. Dr. Carter stopped walking and stared at the alien ship with her mouth open. Colonel Murphy pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Dr. Rogers began talking rapidly into a recording device. Agent Wilson just stood there, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is impossible," Dr. Carter whispered. "This technology is centuries ahead of anything we have." Frank walked over to the triangular door and placed his palm on the surface. The door scanned his hand and slid open with its musical chime. The 4 visitors jumped back in surprise. "Only I can open it," Frank explained. "The ship responds to my DNA." Frank led them inside Guardian, showing them the control room and the floating star map. He demonstrated how the panels responded to his touch and how the AI communicated with him through the neural interface. The visitors watched in amazement as alien text transformed into English before their eyes. "My God," Colonel Murphy said. "This is a warship. Look at these weapon systems." Dr. Rogers was examining the walls and ceiling, running his hands over the smooth surfaces. "The material is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's not metal, not ceramic, not plastic. It's something entirely new." Agent Wilson was more practical. "How long has this been here? Who else knows about it?" Frank explained everything he had learned from the AI. He told them about the Helix Confederation, the Devourers, and the coming invasion. He showed them the images of destroyed worlds and explained how Guardian had been waiting for a human pilot. The four visitors listened in stunned silence. When Frank finished his explanation, they stood quietly for several minutes, trying to process what they had heard. "You're telling us that hostile aliens are coming to Earth in 6 months?" Colonel Murphy asked. "Less than 6 months now," Frank replied. "It can give you the exact countdown." Dr. Carter was studying the star map, looking at the red dot that represented Earth. "And you're saying that this ship is our only defense?" "As far as I know," Frank said. "The AI has been trying to contact other Helix survivors, but most of them are probably dead or in hiding." Agent Wilson was taking notes in a small book. "We need to contact the government immediately. The president needs to know about this." "Wait," Dr. Rogers said. "Before we do anything else, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Frank, can you show us the ship's weapons?" Frank connected to the neural interface and brought up the weapons display. The floating hologram showed energy cannons, missile systems, and defensive shields. The numbers were staggering. Guardian had enough firepower to destroy a small moon. "This is incredible," Colonel Murphy said. "But you're telling us that the enemy has hundreds of ships like this?" "The AI says their ships are different," Frank replied. "More powerful in some ways, but also more predictable. The Helix tried to fight them honorably, but humans might have an advantage because we think differently." Dr. Carter was studying the genetic analysis that Guardian had performed on Frank. "This is fascinating. The alien modifications to your DNA are subtle but significant. They've enhanced your neural pathways and improved your reflexes. But Frank, I need to ask you something important." "What's that? Are you the only human who can pilot this ship?" Frank thought about the question. "The AI says I'm the only one. It's found so far, but there might be others. The genetic markers were placed in the human population thousands of years ago. They could have spread to other people." Dr. Rogers looked excited. "We need to test other people. If we can find more compatible pilots, we might be able to build a fleet." "With what?" Agent Wilson asked. "This is the only ship we have." "But we can study it," Dr. Rogers replied. "We can learn how their technology works and try to build our own ships." Colonel Murphy shook his head. "There's no way we can build technology like this in 6 months. It would take us decades, maybe centuries." Frank felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders again. These people were smart and capable, but they didn't understand what they were facing. The Devourers had destroyed civilizations that were much more advanced than Earth. What chance did humanity have with just one ship? "We need to contact other world governments," Agent Wilson said. "If this threat is real, everyone needs to know about it and cause a worldwide panic?" Colonel Murphy asked. "Can you imagine what would happen if people knew that aliens were coming to destroy Earth?" Dr. Carter was still studying the genetic data. "Frank, I need to run some tests on your blood. If we can understand the genetic markers better, we might be able to find other compatible pilots." "There's something else," Frank said. "The AI told me that the Devourers are coming to Earth because they detected Guardian's energy signature. If I hadn't found this ship, they might have ignored Earth for years." The group fell silent as they absorbed this information. Frank had not only discovered humanity's only hope for survival, but he had also attracted the attention of humanity's greatest enemy. "It's not your fault," Dr. Carter said gently. You couldn't have known what would happen. But what do we do now? Frank asked. I'm just an old mechanic. I don't know how to save the world. Colonel Murphy put a hand on Frank's shoulder. You're not alone in this. We're going to help you, all of us. Agent Wilson closed her notebook and looked at Frank with new respect. We need to set up a secure facility around this ship. We need to bring in the best scientists and military experts in the world. And we need to do it all in secret. Can we really keep this secret? Dr. Rogers asked. Something this big? We have to, Agent Wilson replied. If the wrong people find out about this, they'll either try to steal the technology or cause panic. We need to control the information carefully. Frank looked around at the 4 people who had become his allies. A few days ago, he had been a lonely old man living quietly on his ranch. Now he was part of a group that was trying to save the world from alien invasion. What's our first step? Frank asked. Colonel Murphy smiled grimly. We're going to turn you into the greatest fighter pilot in human history, and we're going to pray that it's enough. Frank nodded, feeling more determined than he had in years. Mary would have been proud of him. He was finally doing something that mattered, something that could help millions of people. The quiet rancher from Montana was about to become Earth's greatest hope. 6 months passed faster than Frank had ever imagined possible. His quiet ranch had been transformed into a secret military base, hidden from the world by advanced technology borrowed from Guardian. The ship's cloaking systems made the entire facility invisible to satellites and aircraft. To anyone driving by, it still looked like an empty hillside. Frank had trained every day for 6 months, learning to pilot Guardian through increasingly difficult simulations. The neural interface had become as natural as breathing. He could feel the ship's weapons, engines, and shields as if they were parts of his own body. Dr. Carter had found 12 other humans with compatible genetic markers, but none of them could connect to Guardian as completely as Frank could. Colonel Murphy had worked with military leaders around the world to prepare Earth's defenses. Fighter squadrons had been positioned at strategic locations, though everyone knew they would only buy time. Nuclear submarines had been equipped with new missiles based on Guardian's technology, though the weapons were crude copies of the original designs. Every major city had emergency evacuation plans that most people thought were for natural disasters. Dr. Rogers had made remarkable progress in understanding Guardian's technology. He had managed to build smaller versions of the ship's energy weapons and installed them on Earth's most advanced fighter jets. The weapons were not as powerful as Guardian's, but they could at least damage Devourer ships. It was not much, but it was something. Agent Wilson had kept the secret remarkably well. Only a few dozen people in the entire world knew the truth about the coming invasion. Governments had been told that a large asteroid was approaching Earth, which explained the military preparations without causing panic. Frank stood in Guardian's control room, watching the countdown timer that showed exactly when the Devourers would arrive. 3 hours, 27 minutes, and 16 seconds. His hands were steady, but his heart was beating fast. He thought about Mary, about his quiet life on the ranch, about all the people on Earth who were going about their normal day without knowing that their world was about to change forever. Frank, Dr. Carter's voice came through the communication system. Are you ready? As ready as I'll ever be, Frank replied. He connected to the neural interface and felt Guardian systems come online. The ship's engines hummed with power, and its weapons charged automatically. Frank could feel the AI's presence in his mind, calm and supportive. Remember, Colonel Murphy's voice said, your job is not to win the war. Your job is to survive long enough for help to arrive. Frank had learned about the help 2 weeks ago. Guardian's long-range communications had finally reached other Helix survivors scattered across the galaxy. Most of them were still hiding, but a few had agreed to come to Earth. The problem was that they were still days away from arriving. Frank had to hold off the entire Devourer fleet by himself until reinforcements could arrive. Guardian, lift off, Frank said. The ship rose silently from its hiding place in the hillside. Frank felt the familiar sensation of leaving Earth's gravity behind as Guardian climbed toward space. Through the ship's sensors, he could see the planet below. Blue and beautiful and completely unaware of what was coming, Guardian sensors detected the Devourer fleet when they were still an hour away. From Earth, Frank stared at the tactical display in disbelief. There were not dozens of ships, as he had expected. There were hundreds. The enemy fleet was so large that it blocked out stars as it approached. "My God," Dr. Carter's voice whispered over the radio. "There are so many of them." Frank felt a moment of despair. How could one ship, even one as powerful as Guardian, fight against such overwhelming numbers? But then he remembered what the AI had taught him about human nature. Humans did not give up, even when the odds were impossible. "All Earth forces, this is Guardian," Frank said into his radio. "Enemy fleet detected. They'll be here in 1 hour. Get ready." Frank piloted Guardian out to meet the Devourer fleet. As he got closer, he could see individual ships more clearly. They were just as horrible as the images had shown, twisted and organic-looking like diseased creatures from a nightmare. The largest ship was the size of a small city, covered with weapons and surrounded by hundreds of smaller vessels. Guardian's AI analyzed the enemy formation and highlighted potential targets. "Recommend attacking the command ship first," the AI said. "Destroying their leadership may cause confusion in their ranks." Frank agreed and set course for the largest Devourer ship. Guardian's engines pushed the ship to incredible speed, crossing the space between Earth and the enemy fleet in minutes. Frank felt the familiar rush of combat as Guardian's weapon systems locked onto their target. "Let's see what you've got," Frank muttered, and fired Guardian's main cannons. The energy beams tore through space and struck the command ship's shields. The massive vessel shuddered under the impact, its shields flaring bright blue. Immediately, dozens of smaller Devourer ships turned toward Guardian, their own weapons charging. Frank threw Guardian into a series of evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible for any human pilot without the neural interface. The ship twisted and spun through space, dodging energy beams and missiles. Frank could feel every shot that came close, every near miss that could have destroyed them. Guardian's return fire was devastating. The ship's weapons tore through Devourer vessels like they were made of paper. Frank destroyed 6 enemy ships in the first minute of combat, then 10 more in the second minute. But for every ship he destroyed, 2 more took its place. "Earth forces engage the enemy." Colonel Murphy's voice crackled over the radio. Frank watched on his sensors as Earth's military forces joined the battle. Fighter jets rose from airbases around the world, their crude energy weapons firing at the approaching Devourer ships. Nuclear submarines launched their experimental missiles from the oceans. Every satellite with weapons capability opened fire. It was brave and heroic, but it was not enough. The Devourers destroyed most of Earth's fighters within minutes. The submarines' missiles damaged a few enemy ships but could not penetrate their heavy shields. The satellite weapons were destroyed almost immediately. Frank found himself fighting alone again. One ship against hundreds. Guardian's shields were holding, but they were weakening under the constant bombardment. Frank's head was pounding from the strain of the neural interface, and his hands were cramping from gripping the controls. "Guardian," Frank said. "How long until the Helix reinforcements arrive?" "Estimated arrival time, 4 hours, 12 minutes. Frank looked at his shield readings and knew he could not last that long. Guardian was powerful, but it was not invincible. The Devourer fleet was wearing him down through sheer numbers. Then something extraordinary happened. Frank's sensors detected new ships approaching from the outer edge of the solar system, but these were not Helix vessels. They were human ships, crude and primitive compared to Guardian, but they were coming to help. "Guardian, this is Captain Don Mitchell of the Hughes Defiance," a voice said over the radio. "We're coming to assist you." Frank stared at his sensors in amazement. Somehow, in just 6 months, humans had managed to build a small fleet of space-capable warships. They were not as advanced as Guardian, but they were armed with weapons based on Helix technology. "How many ships do you have?" Frank asked. 12. Warships, 36 fighters, and a whole lot of determination. Captain Mitchell replied, The human fleet engaged the Devourers with desperate courage. Their ships were destroyed quickly, but they inflicted damage on the enemy and drew fire away from Guardian. Frank used the distraction to destroy the Devourer command ship, causing chaos in the enemy ranks. More human ships arrived, and then Frank realized that governments around the world had been secretly building fleets for months, preparing for this moment. The ships were no match for individual Devourer vessels, but their crews fought with a ferocity that surprised the enemy. "This is Admiral Sarah Johnson of the UES Victory," another voice said. "All human forces follow Guardian's lead. Show these things what happens when you threaten Earth." Frank felt a surge of pride as he watched human ships fighting alongside Guardian. They were outgunned and outmatched, but they refused to give up. Ship after ship was destroyed, but their crews kept fighting until the very end. And then, just when Frank thought all hope was lost, his sensors detected massive energy signatures approaching from deep space. The Helix reinforcements had arrived early. Dozens of advanced alien warships dropped out of hyperspace and immediately engaged the Devourer fleet. These were survivors from a dozen different civilizations, all united in their hatred of the Devourers. They had heard Guardian's call and come to fight. The battle turned in an instant. The Devourers found themselves caught between Guardian and the human fleet on one side and the Helix survivors on the other. For the first time in centuries, they were outgunned. Frank watched in amazement as the tide of battle shifted. The Devourers, so confident in their superiority, began to retreat. Their massive fleet broke apart as ships fled in all directions. "Guardian, this is Admiral Vex of the Helix Resistance," an alien voice said. "It is good to see our old ship fighting again." "Well done, human pilot." Frank smiled as he piloted Guardian in pursuit of the fleeing Devourers. The battle was won, but the war was far from over.